Welcome everyone to the final session of the SPA Regional Conference 2021 for Wales. This is our fourth and final talk of the day, and it's something I'm not sure if we really managed to do at one of these regional conferences before, but it is a session on reporting in the Welsh language. This is obviously something that our regional conferences allow us to do in a way that we can't do at our national conference. It allows us to have a bit of a different focus, and it's great. And I'd like to welcome Megan, who works for the BBC, who has kindly agreed to come and speak to us all. So welcome, Megan.
Hello, thank you for having me virtually.
So do you want to start off by talking a bit about sort of your background and how you got into journalism?
Yeah, of course. So I was trying to think about how I would explain this to you earlier, actually. I probably started writing and taking an interest in journalism when I was about 15. So about that time in comprehensive school when they tell you that you need to start thinking about doing some work experience. I'd had my heart set on various other things that didn't quite come to fruition, partly because I didn't quite know where my talents lay at the time. So I started writing and dabbling with work experience in that sense. And sort of quite quickly it became something that I was doing on a regular basis. So I started volunteering. I helped, for example, to edit the local newsletter. So really small little things in my village and in my town. And then in school where we sort of had like a school magazine and stuff. And then as you creep towards kind of A levels and going on to university, higher education, it became quite obvious that that's what I enjoyed doing. And that's what I spent my time doing. It became a bit of a hobby. So that when I went to Exeter University in 2014, I decided that I was going to study English literature and French, just so that I didn't sort of narrow myself into purely doing journalism. You know, there might be people watching who are doing a BA in journalism, and that's absolutely fine. They're brilliant courses because I don't think there's a sort of a direct linear route to being a journalist. But I decided I was just going to kind of keep it open, and learn to speak French as well, which has proved to be helpful in the long run. And when I got to Exeter, I'm sure there might be people watching who are currently at Exeter. There are plenty of different platforms to sort of practice your writing skills. Weirdly, I didn't do anything from a broadcast perspective when I was at Exeter. I think I was slightly too apprehensive about putting my face out there or even lending my voice to radio or podcast. So I purely did print at Exeter. And then as part of my course, it was a 4-year course, which included a 1-year Erasmus year at the time. So it was 2016, 2017. And I found myself going to live in Paris shortly after the really tragic Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo attacks. And I don't know if you know much about the Erasmus scheme, but you have sort of 3 options, and I'm generalizing here, but you can go and study, you can go and be an English language assistant in a French school, or you can pick to do an apprenticeship / work experience placement, if you like. Which is what I decided to do because I thought maybe I'd be able to merge the French and the journalism. So we can talk about that later if you want, but I had a few various different placements on my time abroad in Paris, which sort of cemented then, if you like, the fact that I did want to be a journalist. So when I came back to Exeter for my final year, the 4th year, which was 2017 to 2018, I dabbled with various other options. I considered joining the civil service. I considered maybe training to be a teacher. And my dad sort of said to me, you've been talking about being a journalist since you could, sort of string a sentence together. So maybe you should try and get some further training. At which point I decided to apply for a course at Cardiff University's Journalism School, which is known to many as CJS. And you might see the kind of hashtag Cardiff trained on Twitter. And decided to do the MA in broadcast journalism there, which is a 1-year course. It's intense and hard work, but it was definitely the best sort of grounding, if you like, for me, from the perspective of having the legal training, the practical training, the really basic training in journalism skills. And then from there, I applied to join the BBC, and I've been there now for nearly 18 months, which is crazy because most of that time has actually been in lockdown. And as you can see from my surroundings, I've been doing the majority of my work from the same desk at which I studied for my GCSEs and A levels, which is a bizarre feeling.
So obviously you said you went on and did the broadcast journalism MA, but you'd before that you'd not done too much of the sort of student journalism broadcasty stuff while you at uni. What prompted you to choose that MA over perhaps one that was more in line with the sort of experience you had from uni?
It's a good question because I did actually apply to do the magazine course. So I was originally going to go and do the magazine course at Cardiff. And just after talking to various different people, I knew a few people that had done the broadcasting course. I decided that, well, I didn't decide, sort of industry research suggests that it's difficult to get a job. We know that it's difficult to get a job, especially a permanent contract. So I decided I needed to kind of widen my field, if you like, and acquire as many skills as I possibly could. And if you'll allow me to sort of lean on cliches, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades in the industry at the moment because of the difficulties that the industry is facing. So I knew I could write a sentence, and I knew I had sort of a bit of experience when it came to magazine and newspapers. So I thought that maybe by doing the course at Cardiff at CJS, I'd be able to then broaden my horizons slightly, and hopefully in the long run give me more of a sort of more job prospects, if you like, then, so that I could do kind of radio, TV, print, podcasting, digital.
Yeah. Yeah. So most of the stuff most of your work is just purely Welsh language reports. Obviously, there's a bit of other stuff, as you've mentioned to me before the session began. So how did you become fluent in Welsh? Is that sort of the where you're from in Wales? Is that where that comes from?
Yeah, so my dad's a Welsh speaker. My mum's actually English, but has lived most of her life in Wales. So I was brought up in a Welsh speaking household, or a bilingual household. Lots of people say they speak Wenglish. I definitely spoke Wenglish as a child. You'd sort of start one sentence in Welsh and finish it in English, and it was a real sort of mosaic then, if you like, of languages. And I went then through a Welsh medium education, so did all of my GCSEs and A levels in Welsh, and then obviously you don't lose that ability to write or read or write or speak Welsh at all. But when I went to Exeter, I think it is fair to say that I probably did let my fluency and my accuracy slip slightly during that 4-year period, that 4-year window, purely because I was concentrating so much on trying to be fluent in French. So any Welsh speaking or writing that I did when I was at Exeter was very informal and would be over text or phoning home. And it was quite funny, actually, because one of the modules that you do when you study a degree in French is you'd obviously do an oral module, you're kind of French speaking. And I used to sort of start dropping in Welsh words in the middle of a French sentence, and I wouldn't realise I was doing it. So it was obviously a bit mixed up there. And then when I came back to Cardiff, came back to South Wales to do the course in Cardiff, it became quickly obvious to me that I needed to really practice my Welsh skills and make sure that I could be as sort of polished as I could be to get a job then, because obviously it just again gives you more sort of job opportunities if you have the two languages.
Yeah. Is that being sort of multilingual, because you're fluent in French as well, so that's 3 languages. Is that a big asset for you in terms of your work?
I think so. I mean, the long and short of it is that I probably wouldn't have got a job with the BBC when I did had I not spoken Welsh. So the long and short of it is that when you can speak another language, you obviously can offer 2 services, can't you? So I'm not saying that I'm kind of some kind of wizard in the newsroom, but it does mean that I can do copy, I can produce copy in English and in Welsh. So it's definitely something that's looked upon favourably. And obviously you hear lots of cliches about being multilingual. You have 2 ways of thinking and you have 2 different personalities. I'm not sure how much I subscribe to those. Speaking a language is a skill. It's a memory. It's a use of your memory as well. But I would say it's definitely helped me with regards to kind of focusing on how I write and how I communicate.
Yeah. Is it a bit of a challenge, sort of? I would imagine that in any given working day, there's sort of a hybrid of the 2 languages in the newsroom or in any meetings. Is that quite a difficult thing to sort of manage and ensure that no wires get across or anything like that?
That's a good question, actually. I've probably never thought about that. The newsroom that I work in, obviously I'm not currently there at the moment, but would normally ordinarily work in, and the virtual newsroom is largely multilingual. We have lots of people that work in Welsh and in English, so it's quite a natural thing. To flip from Welsh to English is quite a natural thing. What I would say is that it's a different way of writing. I'd argue, and I hope I'm not offending anyone, English is probably a pithier language to write in. You can be a little bit snappier in English. Obviously, the grammar in Welsh is completely different. And I'd allowed myself to slip out of the habit of writing in the Welsh language. So I definitely found it quite difficult when I went to work for Radio Cymru, and I was writing on a regular basis in Welsh. Just because obviously people watching or have had experience of a newsroom, as much as obviously accuracy is important, things are turned around quickly, and you have to be able to turn your hand to things quickly, turn copy around quickly. So that was a very long-winded way of answering your question. Yes, sometimes it is difficult, but we are in the habit of it now, and I'm sort of constantly learning how to juggle that and make sure that I can communicate as succinctly as possible, which I've just failed to do in that question.
Well, when you're reporting all day, it can't be as easy to be as succinct in real life.
Not at all.
Is it? But I suppose sort of Welsh language reporting and other reporting that isn't in English throughout the sort of regions we represent is really important, because there will be people for whom that is their first language, won't it? So it is really important to have that service, and to
It's
yeah.
essential. It's essential that people can see themselves on screens and hear themselves on the radio. And I'm not an expert in the demographic of Wales, for example. I can't tell you which regions speak more Welsh than others. I mean, someone will be sitting at a desk working that out. We know there's a census coming out this year, so we might have a clearer understanding. But there are definitely people for whom watching the news, hearing the news, consuming the news in their mother tongue is a far more pleasurable experience, and they will understand it more accurately when it's in the Welsh language. So it's an essential service, but also for people who contribute to our services as well. They often feel more comfortable giving an interview in the Welsh language, and I found that over the last sort of 18 months. If they're talking about something that's really emotive, something that's really difficult, if they can express themselves in that language, you get a better interview out of them, because they become more comfortable, they relax in front of the camera, and that's not to be underestimated, be that in English or in Welsh. When you point a camera at someone, I do it, you often seize up, you become quite nervous, clammy. So if you can talk to them in their native tongue, I think it definitely puts people at ease.
Yeah. Is there also sort of print publications being published in Welsh as well as sort of the broadcast side?
Yeah, there are. So the BBC have obviously the when you go into the BBC News website, for example, you see sort of the tab for Wales. You also will see, if you've looked for it, a tab says Cymru. So all of our copy is published. It's not a direct translation. We have journalists that work purely in Welsh copy online. It's called Cymru View, and their audience is growing all the time. They're developing digital strategies. From the perspective of other publications beyond the BBC, obviously I don't work for them, but there are magazines like Golwg who publish in the Welsh language, and that'll be news, opinion, features, that kind of thing. And independent magazines like A Stamp, for example. The Stamp doesn't necessarily cover news, but they publish creative works. So yeah, it's a thriving, I could go on for ages and individually list all of these people working effortlessly. But it's definitely something that I think is doing really well, and long may that continue, I think.
Yeah. As well as working in sort of Welsh media, you also worked for Vogue, I believe, as a translator of some kind. What did that entail?
Yeah, so as I sort of briefly referenced earlier, the year that I chose to go and do my Erasmus year in France, you have to do a certain amount of work experience then, if you like, with an industry of your choice. So some people go and work for as I said earlier, an English language assistant at a school, for example. So I was lucky enough that I got a 3-month placement with a publication house called Uni Edition. It was lovely. I used to get up and see the Eiffel Tower and sort of trudge to work with my little coffee and pretend like I was working really hard and absorb all this French language. And they publish magazines called Régal, obviously it's a food magazine, and Santé, which kind of does what it says on the tin, it's a health magazine. And after 3 months with them, I still had quite a lot of time to fill to get my points then, if you like, for the Erasmus year. And the situation at that magazine, they didn't let me down by any stretch of the imagination, but the situation changed, and they said that I wouldn't be able to continue doing work with the magazines. And from what I understood, the work they were going to give me would be sort of crunching numbers. Now, I'm grateful enough to say that I passed my maths GCSE, but the thought of spending my day, sort of 8 hours a day, crunching numbers in French didn't fill me with hope. So I think it was a sort of gentle nudge from the boss at this magazine to go and kind of find new adventures, if you like. And I'm not overly emotional, but I had a bit of a wobble because I thought I was going to find myself unemployed in Paris on my own. And I remember being on the phone to my mum, and I was like, I'm not going to have a job. It was all so sort of dramatic and over the top. And she said to me, well, what is it that you'd like to do? And I think I flippantly said that I'd like to go and work for Vogue. And she said, well, get in touch with them then. So I did. I found the email address and I said that I would be available for 6 months from January to the summer, and that I could speak French and I could speak English, and I was willing to work whatever hours they wanted me to work and do whatever it was that they wanted me to do. And they didn't reply. So I thought, I'm going to email them again, and email them again, and eventually track down the lady that I needed to be contacting from various different sort of days of research. And she was a very lovely lady. She is a very lovely lady called Kate, and Kate gave me an interview and a translation test, and she said, you can come and work for us for 6 months as a paid intern from February to August, and I was translating French articles into English for Vogue Paris's French and English website, which was, you know, a bit of a pinch me moment, because I love fashion, and it sort of, yeah, it was one of those things. I thought, I can't believe this is actually happening. And I, you know, it's sort of, what is it now? It's like kind of 5 years. No, it's not, 4 years later, and I'm still talking about it. And I'm probably still going to talk about it until I'm sort of in my 80s and everybody's fed up.
How difficult is like translating sort of a big block of text from one language into another? Because I think you said you do it a bit with sort of the Welsh stories you do. If there's interest, you'll translate them into English as well. How much of a challenge is it to translate such a big sort of, well, block of text, I suppose?
Yeah, no, it's difficult. I wouldn't offend professional translators and call myself a professional translator, because these people that work day in, day out as translators are so skilled. And I could never work as an interpreter either, because the kind of mental capacity that you need to be able to accurately communicate to somebody else in a different language is just, it sort of blows my mind. What I would say is, I think you can't look at it as a direct translation, a word for word translation. I think the key skill that I learned from my time in Paris, from the modules that I did at university, and from the time I've spent at the BBC, is that you have to understand what they're trying to say. Not necessarily how they say it, but what are they trying to say? What's the message they're giving across? So, you know, you have the flexibility of changing the words slightly to portray a meaning. And that's really hard, because it can be as simple as, if you go into the office and you're tired, the words aren't on the tip of your tongue, and you start phrasing things in a really clumsy way, and so the writing isn't elegant, or you don't quite do them justice. And then you also have to factor in that people who live in North Wales speak very differently to the people that live in South Wales. So you have to kind of think about the tone and the register, you know, how am I doing them justice? And maybe, I think probably what I've learned at the BBC is different to Vogue is, you know, you don't want to misquote someone by messing up one word in a sentence that you've translated, because people get really offended, and it's our job to do them justice when we communicate their opinion. So yeah, I wouldn't call myself a professional translator. I would say it's difficult, but I do think, like anything else, it's a skill, and it's something that I'm not excellent at at the moment. I'm working at it all the time, and trying to sort of pick up skills from those around me that have been doing it for like 20-30 years.
Yeah, I imagine one of the biggest challenges has to be sort of keeping the nuance to a text when you're shifting it from one language to another. So to go from sort of translating fashion articles to obviously coming back and finishing your degree and doing another degree, and then going into like news journalism has to be quite the change in terms of the sort of what you were doing on a day-to-day basis. How do you find that, and how do you sort of manage that change?
That's a really good question. I think the fundamental skills are the same. So you're dealing with people, you're asking questions, you're trying to get to the heart of a story to determine what the headline might be, what the important message is. You work into deadline in kind of pressurized situations quite often. So I think the skills are the same. The context is obviously very difficult, different, sorry, not difficult. What I was going to say is that I've gone into the news industry, into broadcast journalism at the BBC, at a time where there's no such thing as a quiet news day. So, I'm not going to profess that I'm the most important person in the newsroom who has loads of pressure put on her, because there are people facing much harder shifts than I do. But obviously I started in July of 2000 and, was it 18? Yeah, 2019, forgive me. And we've had a general election, we've had a new prime minister in the UK, we've had Brexit deals, and then when I thought things were starting to calm down, we went smack bang into a global pandemic. So I think the skills are the same, from going to Vogue to training to my training to Cardiff. The skills are largely the same. The content and the things that I'm covering are different. And obviously, and I won't pretend that that's been easy, because sometimes it's like, I can't write another script about horrific figures because it's heartbreaking, but you just have to get on with it, I think. And I keep reminding myself, I'm not on the front line dealing with people in ICU, which sounds like a really dramatic thing to say, but as difficult as it gets, I'm in a very privileged position to be doing the job that I do.
And I think what you just touched on with the reporting in the pandemic, I think that's another aspect where having people reporting in the Welsh language is really important, because the media has had a really important role in the last sort of 10 to 12 months in putting that public health message out there and making sure everyone's aware of the restrictions, especially given how much they change and so on. So I think that's a really important sort of role that I think your job has as well.
Oh, completely. And I think I've become really aware of that in the last year. What I say to someone in a bulletin, be that a 2-minute bulletin, or what I say to them in a pre-produced package on the radio, can actually affect the way they live their lives. And it's a matter for a lot of people of life and death. That is the reality of this. So I think I definitely don't underestimate the role that we have as a team have to provide accurate information to people at the time of real worry and real anxiety.
Yeah. How has the sort of the pandemic sort of influenced and shaped your sort of working practices and how you've been able to develop your skills over the last sort of year?
I think from a really simple perspective, obviously you can see I'm in a bedroom at the moment. I've done 95% of my work from my bedroom in the last, from the middle of March onwards. So one of the main things that I do as part of my work with Radio Cymru is read the bulletins. And the bulletins have been read from my bedroom. So I kind of like, sort of 5:58, I'm going around the house saying shh to everybody, kind of like make sure everything's switched off, turn the radio off, because I need radio silence, if you like, to broadcast the bulletin from my bedroom. So that's been weird, because I'm used to being in an office with God knows how many other people, and comparing things to them, asking them for tips, asking them how they'd word this or how they'd communicate that, to suddenly being on my own and messaging them all on Skype, so that's been a bit of a shift. And also considering that I'm only sort of 18 months into my professional career then, if you like, it's been a bit of a weird one, because now is when I'm doing so much of my learning, and I'm doing it all through a screen. I'm not sat next to my colleagues having a coffee and talking through things that I might have done well or things that I might have done incorrectly or whatever. So yeah, that's been interesting. From a positive perspective, I think it's actually opened up a lot of doors for us. It's taught us to be really resourceful and creative in the way that we produce things, be that a bulletin or whether that's a podcast, or content for social, for example. We've been able to access Welsh speakers living in Australia because we now realise that we can collect all of their interviews on Zoom, which is a really exciting thing, because I spoke to a Welsh speaker in Qatar the other day who was running a race for a charity for children in Yemen. That was really amazing for me, because there was no way I would have interviewed him in an ordinary situation. So it's had its pros and its cons, but I think we've adapted really quickly, and it's just taught us, I think, obviously I'm only speaking from my perspective, but it's taught us that we can adapt really quickly and be creative in a really difficult situation.
Yeah. I've noticed a lot of people, especially sort of our members, sort of taking advantage of like the last 10 months to sort of put themselves out there and start freelancing and stuff like that, which I think is an opportunity that the pandemic has afforded them that perhaps they wouldn't have done otherwise, which has been really good to see. On the topic of our members, many of them are sort of on the cusp of sort of starting their own careers in the media. Quite a lot of them being involved in their student paper is like the first experience they'll have of the media, or of sort of writing and getting work published and so on. And if they start writing in like the first or the second year, they might get to the end of the third year and think about sort of how they might improve their skills through training. Would you say an MA like you did was the best sort of route for getting that, rather than for like trying to get work experience, or maybe an NCTJ kind of thing?
As I said earlier, I don't think there is a correct answer to that question, in the sense that I don't think anybody has a how to be a journalist guide, and you start here and then you do this and then you do that. I really don't think there's a linear process to a successful career in journalism, whatever you think that constitutes. What I would say is there are various different factors on there. So, an MA is an incredible way of doing it, because you have this really good grounding. It's a seminal course. You're surrounded by experts in their field it's where you do your learning. I always remember thinking to myself, if I'm going to mess up, if I'm going to make myself look stupid, I want to be doing it in an academic environment, so that when I actually do go out there and produce things that the general public can consume, I'm not kind of winging it, so to speak. But obviously, there's no getting away from the fact that these courses are expensive. So lots of people don't have the luxury, and I'm very aware of that. Saying, "Oh, go and do an MA," it's not an option for a lot of people. And there are scholarships out there. I was lucky enough to have one. There are scholarships out there, and there are funding opportunities out there, but it's not as simple as that. I know people that have gone on to do other training courses and have gone on to have amazing careers. And I also know people that have had work experience and then gone on to have amazing careers. So yeah, if you can do a course, if a course as an opportunity is available to you, and you have the opportunity to do it, I would advocate it. But I also don't think you need to write off your career as a journalist if the course isn't an option.
I think that is something that the pandemic has sort of been a bit of a leveler on, in that there's been quite a rise of sort of sites where people can write, or I think a rise again in people making their own blogs, which I think has sort of it fell away a bit, and it's made its way back, which I think is a good thing.
Definitely.
I had a question. I've completely forgotten what it was. Well, this I should say, if anyone is watching on the live stream and wants to ask Megan any questions, there is a chat function on our live streams, which we're keeping an eye on. So if anyone wants to put any questions in there, that'd be good. I have no idea what that question was going to be.
Only nice questions, please.
I'm only capable of asking nice questions. You said that you still use your sort of French a bit in your work now. Could you expand a bit on how you use that?
It's very rare, very, very rare. But for example, in the last couple of weeks, it's fair to say that there have been tensions between London and Brussels in light of Brexit deals. And was it last week? The time just seems to fly by. Last week, the kind of tensions regarding the AstraZeneca vaccine and the exportation of that vaccine. So some days it's really as simple as keeping an eye on French headlines, be they headlines on radio stations or TV channels, or in the newspapers. So I keep an eye on newspapers like Figaro and Le Monde, and kind of just in our meetings and our editorial meetings feed into the fact that I've been keeping an eye on those headlines. And we quite often on our flagship breakfast show have sort of a conversation about what's going on in Europe and how French, Spanish, Italian, German newspapers are covering the headlines from their perspective. So sometimes it can be that simple, kind of turning to French language output for inspiration and perspective. Other times it can be as a translation function. So I'm sure you're aware of the really tragic story of Emiliano Sala, which obviously had a strong Welsh connection. And BBC Wales have done work around that story over the last year or so. And I was lucky enough to be able to help with the translation of some of the interviews that were gathered. So yeah, it varies from time to time. Sometimes I wish I could do more, but the reality of it is that the opportunity isn't quite there because of just the day-to-day output doesn't require it. But like everything else, I think I said earlier, language is a skill, and I'm trying my best to keep practicing it, because it really is a case of if you don't use it, then you lose it. So yeah, that's kind of the long and short of it, really.
Yeah. One of the reasons we sort of wanted to put this session on was because we're aware that quite a lot of our Welsh member publications, we don't have any that write exclusively in Welsh, but we have, I think anyway, but we have quite a few that have sort of a Welsh language section, and we have obviously a Best Welsh Language Award, which the winner of will be announced in just 2.5 hours for anyone watching. So we're really aware that our members are sort of writing in Welsh, and we're really proud that there's members writing in other languages, because that's a really impressive thing. Obviously, that like quite a lot of us can only speak one language. I can barely speak that one. So is it? Do you have any advice for perhaps young journalists who obviously fluent in Welsh but don't quite have the confidence to start writing Welsh? Do you have any advice for them in terms of how to start going about writing in Welsh or broadcasting in Welsh, and sort of taking that first step?
Yeah, I do, definitely. And I think the key word you just picked up on is confidence, because that is what is sort of at the heart of your ability to do anything in Welsh or French or whatever language you're speaking in, is confidence. For people listening at home, I'm really quite sort of young then, if you like, in my career, and I would say if you rewound a year, I was in a position where I wasn't 100% confident that I was good enough to be broadcasting and writing in Welsh. And I'm lucky enough that the team that took me on at Radio Cymru saw something, and forgive me if this sounds cheesy or cliche, but saw something in me that had potential. Because I think when you write or you broadcast in another language, you make yourself quite vulnerable. And open to criticism, because when you're learning or you're practicing or you're out of practice, you quite quickly make mistakes, quite frequently make mistakes, and you make yourself vulnerable. And in a job like journalism, you don't want to make yourself vulnerable, because you're constantly trying to get everything perfect and get the facts accurate and ask the right questions. And make sure you look like you've got it all together, So what I would say is that if there are people watching who can speak Welsh but don't quite feel as if they're ready to go out and broadcast or write in the Welsh language, the top tip is to just consume. consume as much news as you can, or articles, features about books, magazines, about sort of art or music, whatever it is that you're interested in. Consume on a regular basis, because it does work. You know, a daily practice really does things sink in. You start picking up vocabulary. You start noticing sentence structures that could be useful for you, and be ready to make yourself vulnerable. So as you're practicing, you know, as you're practicing, you're honing your skills. Then, if you like, submit articles, ask for feedback, and I would say, you know, I can only really speak from the perspective of the BBC, but people want you to do well. Editors, managers, teams want you to do well. So if you go in and your skills are a little bit rusty, and mine were, I went in and I said, I'm concerned that my grammar isn't perfect. They will help you. You know, there are people around to help you, to help you polish those skills then, if you like. And I think as long as they can see that you're willing to put the time and the effort in, then they are 100% willing to give you that support.
Yeah. Do you think it's encouraging to see that that, you know, the student publications and stuff do recognise the importance of having like a Welsh language section and keeping it regular updated and stuff like that? Do you think that's important?
Totally, yes, of course it is, because the student publications should reflect the students that go to the university and that consume those publications, and obviously, you know, for example, Cardiff, Swansea, they're obviously going to be Welsh speakers there, but also, you know, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that Exeter would have had a Welsh language section, but you know, that Welsh speaking students go everywhere. You know, it sounds really cliche, but one thing I've learned working for Radio Cymru is that if something happens anywhere in the world, I can almost guarantee you there will be a Welsh speaker in that area. It baffles me. We'd be sat in the newsroom and something happens and they're like, oh, I know someone that lives in Israel, or I know someone that's on her work experience in Melbourne and speaks Welsh. You know, it's one of those things. You know, I think having a lively sort of Welsh language section at a magazine or a newspaper is really important, because there's plenty to cover and plenty of people to contribute.
Yeah, it's really encouraging in terms of sort of there being people ready to take up sort of next year's Welsh language jobs in the year after. There's a constant stream of people joining the industry as well. If there's places for them to hone their skills by writing in Welsh, that means there's then going to be people sort of every summer thinking, I quite like this. I want to figure out how to. Oh, well, I want to do this for a living, basically. Do those jobs exist? Are there like perhaps grad schemes geared towards Welsh language reporting or anything like that?
Yeah, so I can only really sort of answer this from the perspective of the BBC, and I'm sure that if I get this incorrect, somebody will correct me. There is an apprenticeship scheme at the BBC, so I don't know what the official term is for it, but I mean, one of my colleagues came up through that apprenticeship scheme, and she did all of her qualifications whilst working for the BBC. Sort of, maybe she's watching, Alice Davies. There's various other names, but Alice did lots of her training in Welsh, and ended up producing items and packages for Welsh language TV and radio, so that the opportunities are definitely there. You know, I can also kind of maybe give a nod to the scholarship that I had when I was at university. I had the Teaglin Davies scholarship by very dint of the fact that I could speak Welsh. So it's an S4C S4C scholarship, Ysgoloriaeth Teaglin Davies, with Cardiff University. So the opportunities are there, and I think I would encourage anybody to go out and research them, ask questions, you know, get in touch with people about what they can do to give themselves a fighting chance.
Yeah, how could people who are putting themselves forward for those jobs sort of make themselves stand out? Because obviously, if you're going for a Welsh language reporting job, then the fact that you are fluent to Welsh might not be that standout characteristic. So what can you sort of do or say to say, yeah, I'm the one who, out of all of us who speaks Welsh, is the one you need to appoint? What can you sort of do to stand out in that regard?
I suppose it's the same thing as what would be required to get an English language job, realistically. Yeah. I mean, you kind of be abreast of what's happening in the industry and the what consumers of news need and require at the moment, and what they want from a broadcasting corporation, or what they want from a magazine or a newspaper. If you can understand how people consume their news, then you can hone your skills to reflect that. So we know that people love podcasts at the moment. So whether you go into a Welsh language interview or an English language interview, if you have ideas for podcasts, or you can analyze why your podcast is successful, and why you'd like to bring that kind of skill to a team, then I think they're going to bite your hand off. I don't think there's a again the sort of a clean cut answer to that question. In my experience, I think teams like it when you're enthusiastic, you're receptive to criticism in a good way, you want to learn. I always remember someone saying to me, don't go into a job and tell them that you want to be a presenter on the news. If you tell them you want to be a reporter, you might just very well end up being a presenter, but they want people that want to go out and that are hungry for stories. So I don't think it's uniquely a Welsh language thing.
Yeah.
Having good Welsh language skills is great, but I think if you go in there with kind of an appetite for work and experience, and you're as simple as being polite to people and you turn up on time, I think you've got half a chance.
Yeah. Obviously, you've just mentioned podcasts, and I think you've mentioned them quite a bit sort of throughout this session. Is that something you've really enjoyed sort of doing more of in the last sort of 18 months while you've been at the BBC?
Yeah, I've been really lucky actually to be asked to do a few projects, producing podcasts. So before Christmas, we had a weekly podcast called Gwleidyddau, which is a political podcast in the Welsh language, that would sort of be roughly half an hour. And I just think it's a different mood to a traditional radio show. People, we know, especially in lockdown, people want to listen to something that's maybe a little bit slower, in its, not necessarily slower in its pace, but gives more breathing space to unpack a story, look at it from different perspectives. You've only got to think of the kind of the success of Americast by the BBC in light of the American election, and Trump's time in the White House. I'm not comparing anything that I've done to anything that John Stockwell and Emily Maitlis have done by any stretch of the imagination. But I think people quite enjoy the maybe more relaxed, chatty approach to news. I don't. Does it humanize it? Maybe it does. Someone once described sort of Nick Robinson's podcast as listening to him undo his tie slightly, relax slightly, and approach it from maybe a more chatty perspective. And I just think it's important that people have those resources at their disposal. Some mornings I want to listen to 15 minutes of hard news, and then other times I might be going for a walk, or pottering around the kitchen and think I've got half an hour to listen to something a bit slower, and something a bit more relaxed.
Yeah, and it's that sort of detailed sort of discussion and understanding you get with a podcast that there quite often isn't time for on radio, just because there's so much that needs to be covered and discussed in like a radio news program, where you don't have to do that as much with a podcast. You can just focus in. Once again, if anyone has any questions they want to stick in the YouTube chat, that'd be good. I've still got a couple more of my own, but if anyone wants to get in and ask anything about reporting the Welsh language, I'm sure Megan would be more than happy to answer. So so obviously you've said you're still quite early on in your career, but what's some of the big do's and don'ts as a reporter and a broadcast reporter that you've learned so far?
That's really good. That's a really good point. Really good question, even. And it's something that I try and tell myself as often as possible, that even though I'm capable of doing my job, I'm also learning every day. So I try to take stock as regularly as possible of the mistakes I've made and what I've learned from them, and kind of trying to reflect as I go on. I think the main one is, don't be afraid to ask questions that you think might be stupid. So where, again, I'm leaning on cliches here, but we're all learning all the time. So if you're sat in an editorial meeting and you think, I don't know who that person is, I don't understand this story, I don't know how we're going to go about that, nobody's going to judge you for saying, I don't get it, can somebody explain this to me? Because they'd rather that you got it right, that you got your facts correct, and you went about your job properly, then you sat there in silence. It takes a lot of confidence as the new kid to sort of say that. But I think people will respect you for being inquisitive. I think one thing that as maybe I've learned is that I've been maybe quite self-conscious of the fact that I've been early in my career, and you know, we hear a lot, don't we, about imposter syndrome and maybe not being good enough. But I think as long as you keep working really hard and asking those questions, nobody can criticize you because you're turning up and you're trying your best. One of the things actually that's been a massive comfort to me over the last 18 months is that the friends that I made at CJS, Cardiff Journalism School, have also gone on to have careers in journalism, and they're also at the start of their careers, and we all have quite similar anxieties about the work we're producing, and the questions we're asking. And that's a real comfort to know that it's not just me that's worried that I'm messing this up or I'm not quite good enough, or I'm asking stupid questions. You know, kind of when I mention those questions, the kind of the obvious thing about being a reporter is to ask the basic questions and make sure you completely cover those straight away. So you know, your kind of who, what, where, why, when questions are like fundamental. If you can cover those and go back with those questions answered, if you've got a fair chance of getting a good story or covering your story correctly. I think I've learned that you need to keep up your relationships with people. So when you have an interview with someone, quite often they can be very emotional, or you're asking a contributor to really open up about something quite personal in their lives, especially in the middle of a pandemic. People are talking about grief, they're talking about loss, they're talking about joblessness, really sort of vulnerable topics. And I think it's important to check in on them, you know, check in from time to time, and just make sure that you keep those relationships going, because when you then do find yourself in a situation where you need to interview someone, people are more likely to talk to you and more likely to say, yeah, I can help you out with this, because they know that you've given them the time and the respect that they deserve. And you know, people are busy, and maybe I'm guilty of not making enough of that effort as much as possible, but I think it really does pay off if you can keep in touch with your sources.
Yeah.
I don't really know what else I've learned, to be honest. I could go on for hours. I'm very aware that I'm rambling.
No, it's fine. You're doing good. And last question. Obviously, this is putting you on the spot a little bit. But what is the best advice you've been given so far in your career?
Wow, that's a great question. One thing maybe this isn't the best advice I've ever been given, but one bit of advice that's been genuinely practical and useful is not to fill the silence. So if you ask a question that is awkward or unexpected, you don't need to fill the silence because your contributor, your interviewee, isn't answering it. Because by you filling it, they're not then going to answer it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think if you're willing to sit in uncomfortable silence for what feels like 3 hours, but it's probably 30 seconds, they end up filling it, and that's the answer that they probably didn't want to tell you that you managed to get out of them. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. We're not trying to catch people out here, but you know, that's when people give their best answer, I think. So I think that I've learned that don't fill the silence, and I also think it's really useful to ask people if there's anything else they'd like to say that you haven't given them the opportunity to say. Because people tend to give really good answers then. So if you're recording audio or you've got a camera on, don't turn the camera off until they've given that answer, because I found, especially when I was training at CJS, that people would give me their best answers as I was walking out of the door with my camera in the bag, and I was like, you should have said that on camera. So I think have the confidence to kind of, again, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but prod, you know, if let them fill the silence and ask them to explain again. Because I think I'm probably, or have been in the past, overly polite. So I worry sometimes I'm eating up too much time. You know, I've kept you for long enough now. Let's just wrap this up. You're okay to ask those questions, and you're okay to wait for those answers, because it's your job.
Yeah. So yeah, that was fantastic. That was a really interesting session. That sort of brings us to the end of the Wales Regional Conference 2021. It was a really good day of different talks on loads of different topics. But the fun isn't quite over, because in a couple of hours, starting at 7 o'clock, we have our regional awards over on the @SPA Journalism Twitter page, with best publication, best Welsh language, very fitting with the session we've just had, best journalist and everything else. So if you were nominated or you put yourself forward, make sure you're on our Twitter page for then. But thanks to everyone who watched and to all the speakers who came throughout the day. It was incredibly insightful, and we hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
And we're offline.